All right, welcome back, everybody. We are continuing our conversation on third-party obligations. We just looked at the Tarasoff versus Board of Regents Supreme Court case establishing a duty to warn third parties. As you recall, Tatiana was murdered by Prodar Pozinjit, who revealed in therapy that he had homicidal ideations. Therapy called the police. Police briefly detained him. Nobody disclosed this to Tatiana or her family. He went on to kill him, plead insanity, go back to India. Everyone lives happily ever after, or not, right? And just to recap what the majority had concluded, when a therapist determines, pursuant to the standards of his profession, his patient presents a serious danger of violence to another, he incurs an obligation to use reasonable care to protect the intended victim, either notifying or taking whatever steps are reasonably necessary under the circumstances, which has been interpreted as a duty to protect, right? Possibly detain a dangerous person. But I wanted to test it, see where we're at. My goodness. The struggle's real. So we have a case study. Remember, the minority dissent Justice Clark in the court case had said that this duty to warn would result in much more violence, worse treatment, overcommitment, and generally not be the best for society. And again, it was a good example of trying to apply what we talked about in class called rule utilitarianism, right? Which rule, if made into a general principle everyone followed, would result in the greatest good to the greatest number. So let's try it out. Is there a duty to report? Dr. Gregory is a third-year psychiatry resident at a large academic medical center. Several months ago, Mr. Green was assigned to his care. A taciturn, overweight, 59-year-old janitor, Mr. Green was admitted to the emergency room with acute alcohol poisoning. He arrived at the hospital after having made a scene at a bar. When he sobered up, Mr. Green explained he wasn't a regular drinker, but had tried getting drunk because he was so miserable. Dr. Gregory had a particular interest in dynamic psychotherapy and had been hoping for patients open to that approach. Before discharge, Mr. Green agreed to return to Dr. Gregory's outpatient clinic for help. Mr. Green was a responsive patient. He pledged never to touch alcohol again and readily admitted that he needed help for depression. In addition to prescribing medication, Dr. Gregory began weekly counseling sessions with Mr. Green. As Dr. Gregory earned trust, Mr. Green shared some intimate details of his past. These are the sort of things that we don't share with regular friends and family because we don't want them to alienate us. Most people, you'd be surprised the amount of people who have this sort of history. He had grown up with alcoholic, neglectful parents and had been molested by a family friend when he was a young boy. As an adult, he had no friends and had not had an intimate relationship for more than 2 decades. I want you to go back and reread that again. Dr. Gregory encouraged Mr. Green to be open and trusting. This is a safe space. Well, if there is anyone who would benefit from therapy, it seems like we have our prime candidate, Mr. Green. Abused as a kid, alcoholic parents, no friends for 20 years. However sad or unhappy your life is, hopefully you all have at least one really good friend. And if you ever want to feel grateful, or compassion, think about the people who don't actually have a single real friend. So there's anyone who needs someone to open up to, right? Seems like Mr. Green. So far, so good. Several months into treatment, Mr. Green admitted that he was sexually attracted to little girls. He quickly added that he had acted on these fantasies. Dr. Gregory, reminded him that it was illegal to download pornographic images of children from the internet. They both acknowledged that it would be catastrophic to act on fantasies. Dr. Gregory's acceptance seemed to embolden Mr. Green. Week after week, the conversation was dominated by descriptions of his pedophilic fantasies. More disturbing still, the fantasies all seemed to revolve around a little girl Mr. Green called A. Though he spoke about her as if she were a real girl, He insisted that she was purely a figment of his imagination. Despite Mr. Green's insistence that this was fantasy, the specificity of the descriptions and specific nature of his fantasies caused Dr. Gregory concern that A was not a fantasy but a real little girl whom Mr. Green had been watching. But if A were an actual child, Dr. Gregory had no idea who she was. A relative, a neighbor, a coworker's daughter? Dr. Gregory was unsure what to do about Mr. Green. On the one hand, he had encouraged Mr. Green to be open about his feelings and private thoughts. He had assured him that he was safe. And this is important, as far as Dr. Gregory knew, Mr. Green had never hurt a child. Everyone's entitled to a private fantasy life, Dr. Gregory thought. On the other hand, Dr. Gregory worried that Mr. Green might be a current or potential child molester. Mr. Green was starting to seem obsessed with the idea of A. If she were a real little girl, she could be in imminent danger. So now, what a strange situation. You got a man who's clearly miserable. He's been abused, he's been molested, he's been neglected, he's unhappy, he wants help. He's crying for help, basically. And he's admitting a thought that's very hard to admit, right? That you like little girls. I mean, everyone knows that that's not acceptable, that that's weird, that if you even have friends and family that like, it's all kinds of bad. And so here he is like daring to open up. I mean, like what happens if this guy doesn't get therapy longer, right? I mean, don't all that suppressed feelings and misery just pop out in violence or destruction or some sort of bad? So like if this therapy can work, I mean, this is a great candidate. But he's got these pedophilic fantasies. He says he's never acted on them, right? And you should give him credit. I mean, you should research people who have pedophilic fantasies and like don't act on them, right? It's like a weird, it takes like a lot of self-control, I guess. And those of you who are like, screw those weirdos. It's like, well, do you get to control what you think? Like what thoughts come in your head? Like if you really trim it down, you don't actually get to choose like what the next thought you think is. If I was to be like, think of a city, your favorite city. Like you don't know what the first city that's going to come to your mind is. Or think of a fruit or a song. Like, things just come out of the gray unconsciousness into our like awareness. Right? So like what does Miss Dr. Gregory do? Let's see what it says. Dr. Gregory finds himself with an increasingly common ethical dilemma in psychiatric practice: how to balance the duty to protect the confidentiality promised to patients with the duty to protect children from a patient he increasingly believes may present a significant threat. It would be hard to overstate the importance of the Tarasoff decisions with respect to medical ethics in general and confidentiality in particular. The essence of the Tarasoff decisions is the dictum that, in conflicts between patient-therapist confidentiality and serious dangers to reasonably identifiable others, protection trumps privilege. In his alliterative distillation of this dictum, the protective privilege ends where the public peril begins. It is important to note, however, that while Tarasoff triggered a rash of duty to warn or duty to protect statutes nationwide, 16 states have adopted a discretionary approach to those duties, and 4 states currently have no duty to warn or duty to protect. As you can see, we have a nice map here of which states have a duty to warn, duty to protect that's mandatory. Wisconsin does. We will come back to this. Some have interpreted it. They don't actually have a duty to warn. They feel that it goes with, the dissenting Justice Clark. We'll return to this in a minute. Where are we? There is considerable congruence between the Tarasoff mandate to breach confidentiality in instances of serious threat or physical violence to a reasonably identifiable person and the AMA's Code of Medical Ethics, Opinion on Confidentiality. Ken Kitness has pointed out, however, that it is an error to infer that because some action is legally required, it is ethically required. Additionally, he warns against violation of personal morality and professional ethics. Even if Dr. Gregory practices in a state with a Tarasov-like duty to protect, it's arguable that not much of Tarasov applies in Mr. Green's case. Think about it. There's no reasonably identifiable victim. It's not like, oh, there's this girl around the corner, yada, 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 and no serious threat of physical violence. He's like, hey, I have these fantasies about an imaginary girl, one, but two, I would never act on them. Like, even if he had identified it, right? He's like, I would never act on this. I mean, I don't know what to do. I need someone to help me, please, right? It's interesting to think, like, where, you can see how Tarasov says you need to have a serious threat, a specific threat. You need to have a clearly identifiable person. We don't have either of those. And yet, many of you probably feel an instinct to warn, right? To do something. So, while Mr. Green's case currently does not appear to trigger the duty to protect mandated by Tarasov, Dr. Gregory may have a duty or an ethical obligation to report Mr. Green to a state child welfare or law enforcement agency. But what exactly will he report and to whom? He'll be unable to identify a child who he believes has been or will be abused by Mr. Green. Like, would he really be justified in breaking confidentiality at this point? I mean, isn't Mr. Green benefiting from this therapy? Like, what happens if he breaks confidentiality? Mr. Green's like, screw you, Dr. Gregory. You're just one more person who's betrayed me and, thrown me under the bus, et cetera, et cetera. We'll let you read through it because this is longer than I want it to be. But in the end, in views of the disclosure has been making about his pedophilic interests, Dr. Gregory should explore with Mr. Green the possibility of adjusting or modifying his medication regimen with the idea of diminishing his symptoms with the use of a chemical cocktail. But basically, it doesn't warrant breaking confidence. He should, or where is it? Where it seems, therefore, that Dr. Gregory cannot ethically report his fears about Mr. Green to law enforcement. This does not mean, however, he should put his concerns aside. So you still paperwork it, but you don't have justification just off that. That's the long-winded way of saying it. So, what would you do? What's going on here? The states have decided. I urge people to go and look at this. You can see states have interpreted it across a variety of ways, and some have interpreted even that so Podar doesn't tell the doctor that he wants to kill someone, but Podar's dad. So now the threat comes from a third party, not your patient. You have an obligation from a third party to disclose or to warn other people. Well, some states say yes, some states say no. Or let's say, so they have what's called the zone of danger. No, these are what I want. So basically, the Tarasov precedent identifies a specific threat to a clearly identified victim, right? And they kind of open it up to what they call the zone of danger. And so just so you know, Wisconsin case law, it's pretty reporting heavy. So the prominent case, Schuster versus Altenburg, this Wisconsin Supreme Court held that the duty to warn extends to whatever steps are reasonably necessary under the circumstances, including contacting police, recommending or requiring hospitalization, which is, restriction of a person's right to leave, or notifying a family member or friend who can help ensure safety. The case law in Wisconsin rejects the idea that the victim must be foreseeable. A psychotherapist has the duty to warn even if the actual victim was not foreseeable. Although Wisconsin does not create a distinction between a generalized statement of dangerous intent and a particularized statement specifying the patient's intended victims. So you can see how, according to this is Wisconsin law, folks, lock and load. If you were Mr. Gregory, Dr. Gregory, you would have had to report, right? That you would have been accountable, even if there wasn't a specific threat and even if there wasn't a clearly identified patient. So this is an extreme, what have you. And I would urge everybody to go and look at the article posted, A Tale of Two States. Basically, like how states have interpreted terrorist, and it's fascinating. I've included a couple of the like further cases that split off the interpretation of it. But they cite things like, what am I doing here? I mean, they cite studies that the duty to warn has not harmed the patient-physician relationship. They also cite stuff that even still, all these decades later, physicians and psychotherapists and psychiatrists cannot accurately predict the violence or the danger of people. And so they do over-report on average 2 to 1 prior and post. So should we be like locking innocent people up or detaining them on the off chance that 1 out of the 20 innocents is actually dangerous? These are the questions I want you to ask. I will next follow up with our case study for the week called Please Don't Tell. But let me know what you think.